The afternoon sun filtered gently through the airport windows as people lined up at the gate, each carrying their own mix of excitement, exhaustion, and quiet hopes of reaching their destinations on time. Among them stood a family of 3, moving with the slow, steady pace of people who had been traveling since early morning. They carried small bags, a folded stroller, and the kind of tired expressions that come from keeping a child calm during long hours on the go. Yet there was something warm and gentle about the way they stayed close together, talking softly as the boarding process began. When their boarding group was called, they stepped forward with relief. The child, a little girl with wide, curious eyes, clung to her parents' hand but kept looking around the jet bridge as if she were entering a brand new world. The parents smiled at her reaction, whispering to her that they were almost done traveling for the day. Inside the plane, the air felt cool and slightly heavy with the scent of cabin cleaning products. Flight attendants stood near the entrance, offering polite greetings as passengers filtered past them. One attendant, stationed near the front, had a stiff posture and a firm expression that barely changed as people walked by. She spoke clearly, but without much warmth, as though she were trying to keep full control of a situation that had not yet become stressful. When the family reached their row, they immediately noticed that the overhead bin above their seats was already full, stuffed with roller bags and jackets from earlier passengers. The father glanced around, hoping to find space nearby. The mother tried to shift a small bag into the remaining gap, but it wouldn't fit. Seeing no alternative, the father gently approached the flight attendant. Hoping she could help them find space, he spoke softly and politely, explaining the situation, but the attendant's reaction caught him off guard. Instead of offering help or even a simple suggestion, she answered with a tone that sounded impatient. She told him to find another bin further down the aisle. Even though the aisle was still crowded with passengers who were trying to reach their own seats, the father, trying to avoid causing trouble, nodded quickly and moved back to his row. He did not want his family to be the source of any delay. The mother offered an encouraging smile, even though she seemed unsure. They tried to organize their things as best as they could, placing their smaller items under the seat and shifting the stroller bag toward an empty spot. A few rows down, the little girl watched her parents quietly. She wasn't upset, but she looked confused as the energy around them grew more hectic. People squeezed by, trying to get to their seats. There was very little space to move. But somehow everyone managed. Once the family settled in their seats, they let out tired breaths. They hoped the rest of the flight would go smoothly. The little girl pointed out the window, delighted by the sight of the wing and the workers moving luggage below. A few minutes later, the same flight attendant approached their row to check seatbelts. The child shifted slightly, trying to reach for something her mother held. The mother gently helped her buckle up, but the attendant paused, watching closely, as if expecting a problem. Her expression was sharp again, and the atmosphere in the row became tense. The mother explained that the child was buckled in and ready, but the attendant seemed unconvinced. She reminded them to follow directions without delay, even though they already were. The parents exchanged a quiet glance, both unsure why such simple things were becoming so tense. Passengers sitting nearby noticed the tone. A few eyebrows lifted subtly as people pretended to focus on their phones or books. The tension was not dramatic enough to cause alarm, but it was noticeable. The parents did their best to stay calm. They didn't want to draw attention or create any real issue. After the pre-flight announcements, the cabin settled into a soft hum of engines warming up. The family sat quietly, trying to shake off the uncomfortable interactions. The child leaned on her mother's arm, finally showing signs of relaxing. The father looked out the window, wanting the plane to take off soon so the long day could end. But the sense of unease lingered. The flight attendant's earlier behavior hadn't escalated into anything major, but it left a feeling that something wasn't right. She checked rows with a brisk pace, giving short instructions that sounded harsher than they needed to be. Some passengers shrugged it off as a busy day attitude. Others watched her closely, sensing that she might be carrying stress from something outside of work. The family continued to keep to themselves, speaking softly and doing everything they were supposed to do. They didn't want to be noticed again. Still, The smallest sound from the child seemed to make the attendant glance over more often than necessary. The mother comforted her daughter, who was now asking why the plane hadn't moved yet. The father whispered to her that planes sometimes have to wait for clearance. He gave her a reassuring smile, but he too felt uneasy. The quiet tension hung around them, not loud enough for confrontation, but heavy enough that he couldn't ignore it. Passengers nearby exchanged small looks with one another. Everyone could feel that something was off, even if nothing had happened yet. The plane felt calm on the surface, but there was an undercurrent of nervous energy that seemed to grow with each passing minute. As the engines hummed louder and the last checks were being made, the flight attendant passed by one more time. Her eyes briefly met the father's, then shifted to the mother and the child. There was something unreadable in her expressions, something that made the father sit up straighter, unsure what she might say next. The little girl tugged gently at her mother's sleeve, asking another quiet question. Her voice was soft, but the flight attendant paused again, as if the sound bothered her. The mother smiled at her daughter and whispered a reply, but even that seemed to irritate the attendant for reasons no one understood. A couple seated across the aisle looked at each other, then at the family, then back at each other again. They didn't want to stare, but it was hard not to sense that something was brewing. No one knew exactly why the flight attendant seemed so tense. Maybe she misread the family's actions. Maybe she was overwhelmed. Maybe something had happened earlier that set her on edge. Whatever the reason, the energy in the cabin was shifting. Little by little, the child rested her head again, unaware of the adult's unspoken discomfort. The parents exchanged another quiet glance, silently promising each other to stay calm no matter what happened next. Outside, the runway waited. Inside, the plane felt smaller than it had when they first boarded. Everyone hoped the supervisor's earlier check had resolved things. But the truth was that nothing had really been addressed. It was only a matter of time before the uneasy tension found a way to surface. As the flight attendant moved toward the front of the plane, passengers watched her go. The family sat still, trying to breathe normally, hoping the next few hours would unfold peacefully. But somewhere in the quiet hum of the engines, it felt as though the story on that plane was only just beginning. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the crew continued preparing the aircraft for departure. The family sat quietly in their row, hoping the rest of the flight would pass without any more uncomfortable moments. But the air still felt tight, as if the earlier tension wasn't finished yet. A soft announcement came from the speakers, reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts. People adjusted themselves, stored their phones, and leaned back for takeoff. The family followed along, doing everything as instructed. The little girl fidgeted a bit, but her mother soothed her gently, brushing her hair with a calming hand. A few rows down, someone tried to shove their large backpack under the seat but struggled. They kept pushing and shifting it, almost blocking the aisle. The same flight attendant approached them quickly. Her tone was sharp, telling them they could not keep the bag that way. The passenger apologized and tried again. The attendant sighed loudly, shaking her head before walking away. Several people exchanged looks. It wasn't that her instructions were wrong, she was simply delivering them in a way that made everyone feel uneasy. The family watched this too. They didn't want to judge her, but it was becoming clear she wasn't having an easy day. The father whispered something to the mother, something like, "Let's just stay calm," and she nodded. Just then, the girl asked her mother for a snack. She was hungry after hours of waiting, and her voice remained soft and innocent. The mother reached into her small bag to find something light to give her. As she quietly unwrapped it, the flight attendant suddenly appeared again. She didn't smile. She didn't ask politely. Instead, she pointed at the snack and reminded them in a firm tone that all passengers were supposed to stay prepared for takeoff and keep things stored away. The mother apologized immediately and put the snack back into her bag. The little girl looked confused but didn't complain. The attendant stood there for a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting for something else to go wrong. Passengers nearby watched silently. None of them felt comfortable after witnessing her tone. But no one spoke up yet. As the attendant walked away, the mother breathed out slowly, trying not to feel embarrassed. She wasn't trying to break any rules. She just wanted to calm her child. Moments later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing that the plane was 9th in line for takeoff. A few more minutes of waiting. People sighed, adjusted themselves, and tried to stay patient. But the waiting made everything worse. The longer the delay, the more the flight attendant walked up and down the aisle. And the more she walked, the more she glanced at the family. It wasn't a normal glance, it was the kind of look someone gives when they already expect trouble at one point. The little girl reached for her mother's hand, and the movement caused the seatbelt to sit slightly uneven. It was still fastened, still secure, but the attendant noticed immediately. She leaned in again, her tone cutting through the low cabin noise. "You need to keep her still," she said. The mother nodded gently and adjusted the belt. She didn't argue. She didn't question. She didn't want to make the situation worse. The father tried to meet the attendant's eyes to show they understood, but she avoided his gaze and continued walking. A man sitting across the aisle whispered to his partner, "They're not doing anything wrong." His partner nodded quietly. The family could feel the weight of being watched. The father placed his hand on his knee, tapping lightly as he tried to stay calm. The mother held their daughter a little closer. None of them raised their voices or acted out. They simply tried to shrink into their seats. Minutes passed. The engines hummed steadily. The plane inched forward in the line for takeoff, then something small that most people wouldn't even notice. The little girl asked why it was taking so long, and she leaned forward slightly as she spoke. Her mother tried to gently guide her back, but before she could finish, the flight attendant returned again. This time, her voice was sharper than before. "I already told you to keep her seated properly." The mother apologized again. Even though the child hadn't done anything alarming, the father spoke softly, saying they understood and were doing their best. But the attendant didn't seem satisfied. "You need to follow instructions immediately," she said, her tone firm enough that nearby passengers stiffened. The father kept his voice calm. "We are following instructions." But that only seemed to annoy the attendant more. She gave the family a long stare before turning and marching toward the front of the plane. The passengers seated across the aisle watched the entire exchange. One of them shook their heads slowly, as if silently saying this was unnecessary. A few rows back, a woman muttered to her friend, "She's really on edge today." Another person whispered, "That family isn't doing anything wrong." The atmosphere shifted again. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. But it was growing tense in a way that made everyone feel the start of something bigger. The family didn't talk much after that. They exchanged quiet glances, each wondering in their own way why things were escalating over such small moments. The little girl leaned her head back, her eyes sleepy. Her parents tried to smile at her, but their worry was starting to show. Finally, after several long minutes, the plane moved into position on the runway. Everyone braced themselves as the engines roared louder. The plane began rolling forward faster and faster. For a brief moment, the tension seemed to fade. Once they were in the air, the seatbelt signs remained on. Passengers settled in, adjusting blankets, closing their eyes, and waiting for the smooth part of the flight. The family hoped that now that the plane had taken off, things would improve. Maybe the flight attendant would relax. Maybe the earlier tension would simply dissolve. But when the attendant returned to check belts again, she paused at their row longer than anywhere else. "Make sure she doesn't unbuckle herself," she said. Even though the child was already resting quietly with her belt secure, the father nodded politely. The mother smiled gently, trying to show no frustration. The attendant walked away again, but her expression seemed to grow tighter each time she passed by. Passengers were now openly noticing. A man in the middle row leaned slightly to look toward the family. A woman with a book lowered it, unsure if she should say something. A teenager glanced at his parents as if to ask silently whether they were seeing the same thing he was. The tension was no longer hidden. It filled the space around the family like a quiet fog. A few minutes later, when the seatbelt sign finally turned off, people began to relax a little. Some went to the restroom. Others stretched their arms. A mother further down the row reached into her bag to hand her child a drink. No one had any issues. The father took a deep breath. Maybe now the flight attendant would leave them alone for a while. But just as he thought that, she returned again, stopping at their row. "Are you planning to move around?" she asked. The father blinked, unsure how to answer such an unexpected question. "No," he said calmly. "We're staying seated." She didn't respond. She only stared for a moment, her eyes scanning the family as though searching for a reason to be upset. Then she spoke again. "Make sure you don't cause any disturbances." The father's eyebrows lifted slightly, not in anger, but in quiet confusion. "We haven't caused any disturbance," he said gently. Her lips tightened. She said nothing else and walked away. A passenger behind them whispered, "That wasn't necessary." Another murmured, "This is uncomfortable." Family heard some of it but pretended not to. They didn't want to escalate things. They didn't want to look like they were arguing. They simply wanted the flight to end peacefully. But the atmosphere had changed completely. What began as a simple misunderstanding had now become something larger, a string of small moments that piled up. Creating confusion, tension, and frustration, the parents exchanged a look, silently asking each other the same question: why was this happening? They had done everything right. They had followed every instruction. They had been calm, respectful, been patient. Yet the feeling of being singled out kept growing. And as the flight continued, passengers around them could feel it too. No one knew it yet. But this uneasy energy would soon reach a point where it could no longer be ignored. Something was building slowly, quietly, but unmistakably. And the consequences of these small misunderstandings were about to show themselves in a way no one could have predicted. The first hour of the flight passed in a slow, uneasy way. Most passengers settled into their seats, trying to get comfortable. A soft buzz filled the cabin, the quiet mix of engine noise and people flipping through magazines or adjusting their screens. To anyone looking from the outside, it might have seemed like a normal flight. But anyone seated near the middle rows could feel the tension circling quietly around one family. The parents kept to themselves, speaking only in whispered tones. The little girl rested against her mother, finally calm after the long day. Every few minutes, the father glanced toward the aisle, hoping he wouldn't see the flight attendant walking toward them again. But she moved up and down the aisle often, her steps sharp and her expression unreadable. Passengers nearby noticed the way her gaze lingered on the family longer than it did on anyone else. It wasn't loud or dramatic yet, but it was strong enough to make people feel like something small could set off something bigger. About an hour into the flight, the girl shifted in her seat. She wasn't misbehaving. She just moved the way any tired child would. She asked her mother quietly if she could have water. The mother nodded, keeping her voice low, and reached into the seat pocket where they had placed a small bottle earlier, just as she unscrewed the cap. The flight attendant appeared again. "You're not allowed to have open containers during turbulence," she said. Even though the seatbelt sign was off and the air was calm, the mother froze for a second, surprised. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know," she answered gently. "We made announcements," the attendant replied sharply. Though the announcement had been about something completely different, the father spoke kindly, keeping his tone steady. "We'll put it away." "It's okay." The attendant nodded stiffly, then lingered against long enough for nearby passengers to shift in their seats. And then she walked on. The girl looked at her parents, confused again. "Did I do something wrong?" she whispered. Her mother hugged her lightly. "No, sweetheart. You didn't do anything wrong." Passengers across the aisle looked at the child and then at the parents, shaking their heads quietly as if to say, "No. She didn't do anything wrong." After that moment, people started paying more attention. Not because they wanted drama, because they sensed something unfair unfolding in front of them. As the flight continued, the crew began preparing for drink service. A cart rolled down the aisle with clinking ice and soda cans, and for a moment, the cabin felt lighter. The sound of cups being filled and passengers asking for drinks softened the energy in the air. When the cart reached the family's row, the flight attendant handling the drinks smiled politely and asked what they would like. The mother asked for water for herself and juice for the child. The father asked for the same. The girl smiled as the cup was handed to her. Everything seemed fine. But just as the drink cart moved past them, The same tense flight attendant appeared again. She didn't smile. She didn't even look at the cups. She simply asked, "Is everything fine here?" In a tone that didn't sound like she expected the answer to be yes, the father nodded slowly. "Yes, everything is fine. Thank you." But the attendant didn't move on. She stood there for a moment, as though she were waiting for something to be wrong. A man sitting in the row behind them muttered under his breath, "What is she doing now?" Another whispered, "She's acting like they're causing trouble." The family heard enough to know other people were noticing, but they kept quiet. When the cart moved away and the aisle cleared, the girl leaned forward again, taking a sip of her juice. The plane hit the softest bump, barely noticeably, and her juice sloshed slightly, but didn't spill. That tiny movement was enough to draw the attendant's attention again. She stepped up quickly, as if she had been watching just for that moment. "You need to keep her cup steady," she said sharply. The father blinked. "It didn't spill." "It could have," she insisted. "We'll be careful," the mother said gently. Trying to avoid another tense exchange, the attendant gave them a long look before finally walking away. This time, however, several passengers didn't pretend not to notice. A woman sitting across the aisle raised her hand slightly as if to ask the attendant something, but then lowered it, unsure if it would help. A man next to her leaned in and whispered, "This is getting uncomfortable to watch." The plane continued cruising smoothly, and most of the passengers returned to their screens or conversations. But the mood near the family was shifting. People were not just observing, they were starting to feel protective. About 30 minutes later, seatbelt sign turned on again due to light turbulence. The plane shook gently, and the girl instinctively held her mother's arm. Her mother wrapped her arm around her, offering comfort. The flight attendant came back instantly. "She needs to sit upright," she said. The mother nodded. "She is upright. She's just holding my arm." "She needs to sit properly," the attendant repeated. The girl, scared by the turbulence now, tried to sit straighter. But her small movements seemed to irritate the attendant further. The father spoke softly but clearly. "She's sitting properly. She's frightened." The plane shook. "We're comforting her." The attendant's expression hardened. "You need to follow directions." The father didn't raise his voice. He never did. But for the first time, there was firmness in his tone. "We are following directions." The attendant didn't respond. She simply stared at them for a moment, then walked up the aisle. The passengers nearby exchanged looks again. Someone finally whispered, "This is too much." The turbulence stopped after a few minutes, but the tension didn't. The girl asked if she could use the restroom. The father pressed the call button to ask if it was okay, since the seatbelt sign had just turned off. The flight attendant arrived again, but not in a helpful way. "Why are you pressing the call button?" she asked sharply. The father remained polite. "Our daughter needs to use the restroom. We just wanted to check if it's allowed." "You don't need to call me for that," she said. "We're only asking because the sign turned off seconds ago," he explained calmly. She sighed loudly, as though he had asked for something unreasonable. "She can go, but hurry." The mother guided the girl to the restroom. As they passed, several passengers gave her encouraging nods, subtle but sincere. When she returned, they settled back into their seats, hoping the situation might calm down. But it didn't. 20 minutes later, the flight attendant returned with a different expression, one that made the father sit up straighter. She crossed her arms slightly. "I need to speak with both of you," she said. The mother and father looked at each other. "Is something wrong?" The mother asked. "You are not following instructions," she said. The father looked genuinely confused. "We've been following every instruction you've given." "You've been resisting," she insisted. The passengers around them couldn't stay silent anymore. A man 2 rows back leaned forward. "That's not true," he said calmly. "They've been doing everything right," the woman across the aisle added. "They haven't caused any trouble at all." The flight attendant stiffened. Surprised that others were stepping in, "This is between me and them," she said quickly. Another passenger, an older woman, spoke up gently. "We're all watching. They're not doing anything wrong. The family sat silently, unsure what would happen next. The attendant looked around, realizing she was losing the support of the cabin. But instead of stepping back, she turned sharply and walked toward the front of the plane. Passengers whispered among themselves. What is she doing? She's going to report them. This is too far. The father sighed and rubbed his forehead. The mother held her daughter close. The girl looked up at her parents with worried eyes, sensing something was terribly wrong, even if she didn't understand the details. Minutes later, the flight attendant returned, but not alone. Another crew member followed her. Someone who had previously been friendly and calm. His face looked uncertain, as though he hadn't expected to be pulled into anything serious. The flight attendant pointed subtly toward the family and said something quietly to him. His eyebrows lifted, clearly surprised by whatever she told him. He looked at the family, then back at her, and asked her something in a low voice. She answered quickly, her tone tight. He approached the family with a careful, gentle expression. Is everything all right here? He asked. The father nodded. We're okay. We haven't had any issues. The crew member glanced toward the flight attendant, then back at the family. His confusion showed plainly. The mother added softly, We've been trying our best to follow everything. Before he could respond, a passenger across the aisle spoke again. They've done nothing wrong. Another chimed in. She's been targeting them the whole time. The crew member turned, surprised to see multiple passengers stepping in. He looked at the flight attendant again, and something in his expression changed. He became more cautious, more aware that something wasn't matching. He nodded at the family. All right. Thank you. Then he stepped aside and spoke privately with the flight attendant. She looked frustrated, gesturing lightly with her hands as she whispered. He shook his head once, as though trying to calm the situation or wait for it to settle. The passengers watched, but the words were too quiet to hear. A strange stillness filled the cabin. It felt like everyone was holding their breath. Something had shifted. Something had crossed a line. And even though the plane was still ours from landing, it was clear to everyone on board that they weren't heading toward a peaceful ending. The quiet tension had become something real, something that could no longer be ignored. Something was about to happen, and it wouldn't take long. The announcement from the pilot had created a strange quiet in the cabin. The kind of quiet that felt heavy because everyone could sense something bigger was happening behind the scenes. People went back to their seats slowly, still whispering, still turning around every few seconds to look toward the front of the plane, where the flight attendant stood stiff and uneasy. Her earlier confidence was nowhere to be seen. Now, she kept her hands folded tightly in front of her, as if she was trying to keep them from shaking. The family sat back down too. Though the man looked thoughtful and the woman kept glancing at her child, brushing a gentle hand over the little girl's shoulder as if to reassure her, everything was fine. The girl didn't look upset anymore, only confused by all the attention and the strange energy in the air. She hugged a small stuffed animal to her chest and rested her head on her mother's arm. Choosing innocence over worry, the flight attendant stood alone for a while before she finally took a slow breath and walked toward the back of the plane. She didn't look at anyone. She walked as if she feared that even eye contact might cause a new wave of comments. It wasn't easy for her either, and even the passengers who had spoken against her earlier could see she was struggling. One of the passengers near the middle of the cabin, a man with a calm voice, leaned toward his seat partner and whispered, She knows she messed up. You can see it in her face. His seat partner nodded slowly. Yeah. No one wants to be in her place right now. At the back of the plane, the flight attendant stepped behind the service curtain and let out a slow exhale. She leaned against the counter, pressing her eyes shut for a moment. She didn't want to cry. Not here, not at work, not where passengers could hear or see her. But the pressure in her chest was heavier than anything she had felt during previous disputes with passengers. It wasn't only the confrontation. It wasn't only the comments or the passengers who defended the family, or even the fact that the pilot had stepped in. It was the realization that she genuinely didn't know how this situation had spiraled so fast and so far. She had thought she was doing her job. She had thought she was following protocol. But now the entire plane seemed convinced she had gone too far. and her own doubts were starting to push. Through the cracks, she pulled out her small notebook, the one she kept for writing down issues or reminders during flights, and flipped through the pages, as if doing something normal might help her regain control. Her handwriting shook slightly as she scribbled down a few lines about the incident, hoping it would help her explain her perspective. If someone from the airline asked, she didn't know they already were. Back in the cabin, passengers noticed two airline representatives approaching the plane from the jet bridge through the small window near the boarding door. A few gasps, a few whispers, then a ripple of curiosity passed from row to row. "Are those airline staff?" someone asked. "Looks like it. Why would they come onto the plane?" No one had an answer, but it didn't take long for everyone's mind to go to the same place: the incident. A moment later, the soft click of the door unlocking filled the cabin, and the door opened. Two uniformed airline supervisors stepped inside. Their presence changed the energy instantly. They weren't smiling. They weren't greeting passengers. They looked serious, as if they knew they were walking into a situation that needed to be corrected, not ignored. The pilot came out of the cockpit again and spoke quietly with the supervisors for a moment. They listened, glanced toward the family, then toward the back of the plane. One of them nodded slowly, the kind of nod that signaled they already knew what needed to happen. "Are they here for her?" a passenger whispered. Another nodded. "Looks like it." The supervisors walked down the aisle with a steady, purposeful pace. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't look around. They were focused only on the back of the plane where the flight attendant stood behind the curtain. Inside the small service area, she heard footsteps approaching, but didn't think much of it until the curtain slid open. She looked up sharply, her eyes widening when she saw who was standing there. "Can we speak with you for a moment?" one of the supervisors asked in a calm tone. Passengers near the back turned in their seats, suddenly silent. Even those farther away leaned to the side, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening. The flight attendant swallowed hard, and stepped out from behind the curtain. She expected them to ask her a few questions. Maybe ask her to explain her side. Maybe clarify protocol. She wasn't ready for what came next. One supervisor spoke quietly but clearly. "We need to escort you off this flight." Her face fell. "Off the flight?" But the supervisor raised a hand gently, not to silence her, but to keep the conversation calm. "There have been multiple concerns raised. For now, we need you to step off while we review the situation further." Passengers heard enough to understand. A wave of whispers moved across the cabin again. "She's getting taken off?" Wow. The flight attendant's eyes darted from one supervisor to the other, her breath catching in her throat. She tried to stay professional despite the shock. "I was trying to follow procedure," she whispered. "We understand," the supervisor replied softly. "But the way things unfolded created a disruption. It's best for the safety and comfort of everyone on board if we remove you for now." Everyone on board. Those words stung. Not because she didn't understand them, but because they reflected exactly what she feared, that her actions had affected not just the family, but the entire plane. She nodded weakly. "May I at least gather my things?" "Of course," the other supervisor said. She walked toward her small storage locker near the back of the plane, grabbing her bag with trembling hands. As she stepped back into the aisle, the cabin fell so quiet that even the hum of the air vents sounded loud. Passengers watched, not with cruelty, but with a mix of surprise and uncomfortable sympathy. They could see she wasn't proud of what happened. They could see she wasn't fighting or arguing. She looked more like someone who had realized too late that she had made a mistake she couldn't undo. The family watched too. The woman lowered her eyes, her expression soft. The man took a slow breath, showing no satisfaction. No triumphs, just a quiet acceptance that the situation had finally reached a point where someone was stepping in. As the flight attendant walked past them, she paused without meaning to. She didn't speak. She didn't apologize. She simply looked at them for a brief second, an expression mixed with regret, frustration, and exhaustion. The woman offered a gentle nod, a small gesture that surprised even herself. Then the flight attendant continued, walking as she reached the front of the plane. A few passengers murmured polite words. "Hope things get better." Take care." She didn't expect kindness, and it only made her chest tighten more. She stepped through the open door and onto the jet bridge, followed closely by the supervisors. When the door closed behind them, the silence inside the plane broke all at once. Conversations rose, some confused, some relieved, some still anxious. The passengers had witnessed something rare, something uncomfortable, something that felt like the climax of everything that had been building since the first moment. Conflict sparked. The pilot returned to the front and made another announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We're almost ready for departure. Our crew will finalize preparations shortly." It was simple, calm, steady, but the passengers all knew the real story was still unfolding somewhere beyond the door. The family sat together, quietly holding on to each other. The woman took her husband's hand. The child leaned against both of them, unaware of how close things had come to getting worse. The mood in the cabin began to settle. But the sense of unfinished business lingered. The passengers didn't know what would happen next, whether the airline would replace the flight attendant immediately or keep the rest of the crew short. They didn't know if the supervisors would come back with updates or if the plane would simply continue as if nothing had happened. But they sensed that the consequences they had just witnessed were only the beginning, because whenever something like this takes place, the real impact and reputations on jobs, on the people involved, always continues long after the plane finally leaves the ground, and soon everyone on board would learn just how far the effects of this moment would reach. The plane sat quietly at the gate, but the tension that had filled the cabin earlier was slowly melting away. Passengers settled into their seats again, some leaning back with a sigh, others adjusting their bags, and many still whispering to the people beside them about everything that had just happened. Even though the cabin felt calmer, no one had truly forgotten what they had witnessed. Moments like these stayed with people. They did not disappear quickly. The family remained seated in the same row, their daughter now curled against her mother's side, holding her stuffed animal like it was a shield that kept the world's troubles away. The parents exchanged soft glances, the kind that spoke more than words. They were relieved the conflict was over, but their hearts still carried the weight of what had happened. No one liked to be singled out or embarrassed, especially in front of strangers on a crowded plane. The father rested his hand gently on his daughter's back. "You okay?" he asked her softly. She nodded, her eyes half closed. "I'm tired." He kissed the top of her head gently. "We'll be in the air soon." The mother gave a grateful smile, even though she still felt a quiet heaviness. She wanted to forget the whole thing, but moments like that stayed in the chest, stirring emotions long after they ended. Meanwhile, the airline supervisors had not returned, and the door to the plane had remained shut since the flight attendant was escorted off. Now the remaining cabin crew were preparing for departure. Another flight attendant, who had stayed quiet during the earlier confrontation, walked down the aisle with a calm, steady expression. Doing her best to bring a sense of normalcy back to the passengers, a few people looked up at her nervously as she passed, perhaps wondering if more drama would unfold. But she offered gentle smiles and small nods, patiently checking seatbelts and overhead bins. She paused near the family. "Is everything all right here?" she asked softly. The mother looked up, surprised by the warmth in her voice. "Yes, thank you. If you need anything at all during the flight, please let me know," the attendant said quietly. That simple gesture eased some of the tension around them. The mother nodded again, this time with a little more comfort. Up front, the pilot appeared over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your patience. We're now fully staffed and ready for departure. We expect a smooth flight today." His voice was strong and composed, holding the confidence that everyone needed. Moments later, the plane pushed back from the gate. The engines roared softly to life, and the aircraft began rolling toward the runway. The passengers settled in deeper, some closing their eyes, others pulling out headphones or books as the plane lifted off the ground and rose into the clear sky. The stress of the earlier incident slowly loosened its grip. People felt the familiar comfort of flight, the soft hum, the slight vibration of takeoff, the sense of moving forward. For a while, everything was peaceful, but even as the cabin grew calm, the story wasn't finished. The consequences of what happened on the ground were still unfolding elsewhere at that moment. In an office not far from the gate they had departed from, the supervisors were seated at a desk, reviewing the report they had written about the incident. The flight attendant, who had been removed, sat in a small room nearby, waiting to be interviewed. Her thoughts were spiraling. She replayed every second of the confrontation over and over again, trying to figure out how everything had escalated to the point of her being taken off the flight. She had never been removed from duty before. She cared about her job. She had worked for the airline for years, but even she couldn't deny that today had gone wrong in a way that she did not expect. When the supervisors finally called her in, she walked slowly toward the office with a mix of fear and exhaustion. She sat down across from them, her hands trembling slightly. One supervisor began speaking gently. "We need to go over the events that took place before departure. Died." "I understand." Another supervisor leaned forward slightly. "We want to hear your side, but we also need to make sure we understand the impact on the passengers, including the family involved." She swallowed hard. "I didn't mean for anything to escalate. I didn't want to upset anyone. I thought the child was causing a disturbance." The supervisors listened carefully, giving her the chance to explain. They weren't angry. They weren't cold. They were professional, but also empathetic. They knew people made mistakes, but they also knew their responsibility was to ensure safety, fairness, and professionalism on every flight. "We appreciate your honesty," one supervisor said gently when she finished. But the situation became bigger than a simple misunderstanding. The passengers felt uncomfortable. The family felt unfairly singled out, and the scene that unfolded disrupted the entire cabin. She lowered her eyes, her voice cracking slightly. "I see that now." The supervisors exchanged a look before one of them spoke again. "We'll need to place you on temporary leave while we complete the full review. After that, there may be additional steps or training required." The words hit her harder than she expected. Leave, review, additional steps. This was not the kind of outcome she had imagined when she boarded the plane that morning. Still, she nodded slowly. "I understand." Back on the aircraft, the mood was continuing to shift. A sense of calm had returned, but something else had settled into something heavier, but also more human. Many of the passengers had spent the first hour of the flight thinking quietly about what had unfolded. The experience had reminded them of how quickly situations could escalate when people didn't understand each other. It reminded them of the weight of words, the importance of empathy, and the power of staying calm. The child eventually fell asleep in her mother's arms. Her small breaths were soft and steady, unaffected by the worries that swirled in adults' minds. The father looked out the window at the sky, thinking about how close the day had come to turning into something much worse. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't bitter. He simply felt tired, wishing the world worked in simpler ways, where misunderstandings didn't lead to such heavy moments as the flight continued. The crew did their best to offer comfort and create a pleasant atmosphere. Drinks were served, snacks were passed around, and some passengers even started small conversations to shift the energy back to something normal. Toward the end of the flight, the new flight attendant approached the family again. "We'll be landing soon," she said gently. "If there's anything you need before we begin descent, please let me know." The mother gave a warm smile this time. "Thank you so much. You've been very kind. It's my job," the attendant replied softly. But her smile showed it meant more than that. When the plane began its descent, everyone sat up a little straighter. The clouds gave way to the view of the city below, and the familiar feeling of returning to the ground settled over the passengers. After landing, the plane rolled smoothly to the gate. People unbuckled their seatbelts, stretched, and began gathering their things. The family waited a little longer to avoid the rush. Finally, as passengers started filing out, several of them paused by the family's row. Some offered small nods, others gentle smiles. "Take care," one said. "Hope the rest of your trip is peaceful," said another. The father thanked them quietly. The mother held her daughter's hand firmly, grateful that the day was ending in a calmer place than it had begun. When they finally stepped off the plane, the air in the jet bridge felt cool and refreshing. The long, heavy morning was behind them. But even as they walked away, the story wasn't just theirs. It belonged to everyone who had seen it, every passenger, every crew member, even the flight attendant who now had to face the consequences of her actions. Stories like these had a way of spreading. People would tell their friends, share their thoughts, reflect on what they had felt. Some would talk about the unfairness, others about how quickly things got out of control. Others still would talk about the gentle moments of the child holding her stuffed animal, the passengers who stepped in, the flight attendants who brought peace back to the cabin. Every person carried a piece of the moment. In the end, the consequences were not just about discipline or mistakes. They were about reflection, growth, and the understanding that everyone, passengers and crew alike, deserved to be treated with patience and respect. And while the day had begun with chaos, it ended with something softer, a reminder that even in tense situations, compassion could change everything.